Galatians. We're going to start with the exercise on slide 1. According to Galatians chapter 1 verses 6 to 9, what is the background to this letter? Please pause the video here so you can answer the question. According to Galatians chapter 1 verses 6 to 9, what is the background to the letter? Well, Paul accuses the Galatians here of deserting Christ and deserting his grace for a different gospel, verse 6. In fact, this different gospel is no gospel at all, Paul says, verse 7. What's happening in reality is that some people are throwing them into confusion and they're trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. But Paul says if anyone promotes a different gospel, even an angel from heaven, let them be under God's curse, he says, verses 8 to 9. Paul is shocked by the Galatians' rapid defection from truth to lies. And he fiercely warns them in this letter about the dangers of turning away from Christ. Introducing Galatians. Paul writes this letter to the churches in Galatia, which is actually a region in Asia Minor rather than being a specific town or city. This is an early letter of Paul's, probably his first recorded letter in Scripture. And it's one of his most forceful, I think, and one of his most passionate. When confronted with false teaching that undermines the true gospel, Paul refuses to compromise. He warns the Galatians, and he makes strong appeals to them in this letter. Paul himself had brought the gospel to the Galatians on his first missionary journey, and he'd founded these churches in Galatia. But in his absence, others had come in and they were distorting his teaching. And so Paul is very much on the attack here. The Galatian churches were being misled by false teachers. People who've today been labelled as Judaizers. Paul is writing his letter with a great sense of urgency, wanting to get the Galatians back on track again. The themes of Galatians are very similar, you may notice, to Romans. These false teachers were questioning Paul's gospel. They were questioning his right to call himself an apostle. They were insisting that Christians from a non-Jewish background, Gentiles, like the Galatians, that Gentiles needed to keep the law of Moses at the very centre of their Christian lives. They needed to become like Jews to become Christians. That was, they said, the only way that people could be included in the people of God. And so the Galatians were being led astray by these people. They were deserting Christ and his message of grace for a religion of rules. And not only did the Judaizers undermine the gospel of grace, they also tried to damage Paul's reputation. They criticised the message by criticising the messenger. They pointed out that Paul wasn't one of the 12 Jerusalem apostles. And so they tried to drive a wedge between the 12 and Paul. Basically, the Judaizers were insisting that the Galatians needed to go back to Judaism if they wanted to obey Christ. Although they were Gentiles, they were being told that they needed to be circumcised. They needed to obey the Jewish food laws. They needed to observe Jewish festivals. They needed the law of Moses at the very center of their Christian lives. These Judaizers, these false teachers, were legalists. They thought that God's not guilty verdict could be earned by obedience. They were nomists. They thought that Christians needed to live under Old Testament law to please God. And they were racialists. They believed that Jewish culture was far superior to any other culture. But as far as Paul is concerned, the things that they're teaching are not the real gospel. Going back to Judaism was going back to slavery, Paul says. Christ was the one that the law of Moses pointed to. Paul insists in this letter that grace needs to be at the center of the Christian life, not law. Everything hinges, he says, on the work of the cross. Through Christ, we've been brought into freedom. Freedom from the curse of the law and freedom from our sinful desires. And says Paul, it's the work of the Spirit that regulates our Christian lives now, not the Old Testament law. Now, God's not guilty verdict is only given on the basis of faith. Trusting in the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross is the only way. In other words, salvation is only possible by God's grace, not by human effort. To try to add anything to God's grace is to betray the gospel. Paul writes this in Galatians 5 verse 1. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. By the way, the fact that the letter makes no reference to the decision of the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15 in AD 48 would suggest that the letter was actually written before that event, maybe just before, at the end of Paul's first missionary journey. The council, you may remember, addressed this very issue and declared with Paul that Gentile Christians didn't need to be circumcised and they didn't need to come under the law of Moses. Well, please notice at the end of your notes a possible outline of Galatians.